Good morning, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar this morning, which is co-hosted by HKA, DLA Piper and Grant Thornton. Just very quickly, got a couple of technical points that I'd like to go over before we start.
Yeah.
You have all joined on mute, which is the default of the system, and you'll remain on mute throughout the session.
Yeah.
We'll be holding a Q&A following the presentation and panel discussion. And at that point, you can either raise your hand, which is a function in the control panel, and somebody will unmute you to ask your question, or perhaps an easier way is to pop your question into the question box, which again is situated in the control panel, which should be on the right of your screen. The webinar is being recorded, but please be assured that that doesn't expose your contact details or your registration details in any way. They're all very safe. And a copy of the recording, a link to the recording, will be made available along with a copy of the slides, should anybody want them, following the webinar. I think that's all I need to say. So I'll now hand over to Dale Evans, who is our moderator this morning. Over to you, Dale. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Suzanne. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to, Suzanne said, this joint HKA Grant Thornton DLA Piper webinar. So I've got the pleasure of moderating the event. So I'll give you a really brief intro to my background. Until recently, I was chair of the infrastructure client group. I am currently chair of Project 13, which is an initiative set up to look at new delivery models for infrastructure. And a couple of points, I guess, particularly in relation to today's event. I'm also part of the recently established infrastructure working group stream within the revised Construction Leadership Council, and I'm part of the industry advisory group for the proposed construction playbook. And I'm also an executive advisor to HKA. So in relation to today's webinar, clearly the last few months have brought unprecedented challenge. I think that's probably an understatement, both in terms of managing and recovering from an immediate COVID-related crisis, but also, I guess, in how we learn the lessons and how we start to anticipate some of the things that will have changed as we come out the other side of this extraordinary period. And today is really a chance for us to collectively reflect on these points, and to do so particularly in relation to the construction supply chain, which I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. So in line with the CLC recovery plan, we're going to do that by considering the challenges both in relation to reset and also what the reinvent phase might look like. So in terms of the running order, as you see here, in a moment I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves. I'll then briefly build on the context I just mentioned. Then our panel will take us through some key observations, particularly around what the reset will look like, what's the role of the client in managing this, and is there an appetite and a volition for reinvention? And then, as Suzanne said, after we've heard from our panel, we'll go into Q&A session and we'll follow the process that Suzanne outlined. So I guess we'll start by asking our panel to introduce themselves, and we'll go in the order here. So David, Gary, Andy, and so David.
Yes, many thanks, Dale, and good morning to everybody who's joined the webinar. My name is David Moss. I am with the law firm DLA Piper, and for the past 35 years, my experience has been in advising on infrastructure projects, primarily through the delivery phase in the UK and globally.
Good morning. I'm Gary Ford. I'm a principal consultant in Grant Thornton's Public Services Advisory practice area. I've over 30 years experience of working on and advising on major infrastructure programs throughout the whole life cycle, from early stages through to delivery, primarily in the transport and utility sector. Thank you.
Andy, are we connected with Andy for intro?
Hi there. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Hi, so my name's Andy Allen. I'm a director of HKA's advisory team. I'm bringing experience from sort of 20 years, starting in civil engineering, major program setup and risk management. Now, in terms of advisory services, my main aim is supporting public and private sector clients improve the maturity and performance of their risk management practices. And really that's about helping them make more effective decisions.
Great, thank you. Will?
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Dale. So yeah, my name's Will Rule, part of HKA's advisory practice. Recently relocated from our Sydney office to London. 10 years of experience in major infrastructure programs and in the transformation of infrastructure organisations across the UK and Australia, helping those organisations fundamentally get more out of their investment programs. I guess my main background is in program development, integrated program delivery, and the commercial strategy that sits behind successful delivery. Back to you, Dale.
Great, thanks, guys. So the prime input today is going to come from our panel, but I did want to just go back and set a bit of a context, and it will be a general one, so forgive me if I generalise a little bit, but in terms of the whole supply chain challenge. So before we went into this crisis, you know, we understood our industry faced significant challenges in how we engage with the construction supply chain, how we procure and how we engage over the extended supply chain. And over time, the reality is we probably have created a very fragmented supply chain. We engage through an in-series model. We see the supply chain as a tiered hierarchy, and our language probably reflects all of that. So as well as creating interfaces and handoffs that add to this complexity and that actually make effective relationships quite difficult to achieve, we then exacerbate that by looking to transfer risk and cascade it through the hierarchy. So even before we went into this, we knew we faced significant issues around complexity, around return, and around cash flow. And these factors, you know, had already given us real concerns about resilience and the sustainability of our supply chain. I think we've also increasingly acknowledged that the way we engage fails to extract the full value and the potential, and certainly the innovative potential that exists within the extended supply chain. And I guess as we've come to recognise that innovation comes from networks and from connections, the wider supply chain, you know, isn't being engaged in a way which creates that, and we haven't created effective conditions for innovation. So, you know, issues we've confronted around resilience, or need to confront around resilience, sustainability, and how we create the conditions for innovation. And I guess the reality is that the COVID crisis has amplified these issues, and hopefully it's an amplification that will reinforce the need to confront and to resolve how we work around the supply chain. So that's part of our context. I guess the other part of our context is that maybe as we come out of the period we've been in, we can capitalise on what feels like a real collaboration in the industry's response to COVID. And I'm sure for many of us, it does feel like we've seen an industry response, and that with that comes possibly a renewed sense of collaboration and certainly a desire for improvement. So that's really the focus for today. Do we have the opportunity to now drive change and to enable a stronger and more resilient supply chain, one that we engage with more effectively, and one that can more effectively contribute to the post-COVID recovery? And our speakers are going to help us consider how we might achieve this change. And as I mentioned before, as we do this, we're going to use the framework that CLC put in place to manage our way through this period. And particularly, we're going to look at reset, so the continuous improvement phase. What does that phase look like, and how do we manage through that? In particular, I guess we want to look at what is the role of the client, both in relation to reset and reinvent, and then to understand, is there genuinely an appetite, and is there the wherewithal for reinvention? So we're going to use that reset reinvention phase. So that's the context. I think I'd now rather hand on to our speakers to take us through that. And the first speaker to talk us through some of the reset scenarios is David. So David, I'll hand over to you.
Yes. Dale, very, very many thanks, and as just been very clearly highlighted, we're living through periods of unprecedented challenge. The COVID-19 is having impact at a depth and an extent not previously found, affecting all aspects of life, but particularly within the construction and engineering industries. And the industries are embracing those challenges and the opportunities within the CLC framework, and also initiatives such as the ICE Green Paper on looking at what the new normal for infrastructure systems might look like. Over this next couple of moments, I will look at Reset, which is the second phase of a three-phase process identified by the CLC. The first being that which we're already in the midst of now, of Restart. The objectives within the Restart carried forward into Reinvent are very much around achieving better value, better performing infrastructure, and here in the UK, global competitiveness. The intention and the objectives, the drivers, are very much being that the time scale is immediate, that the post-COVID recovery must look to try to increase output, maximising employment, and also minimising disruption. Those aspirational objectives are aligned to trying to ensure increased productivity and a strengthened supply chain, which will be the focus of the discussions this morning. Very much the focus within this period is on collaboration and avoidance of disputes. You'll see there on the slide that we've identified some of the ways in which they can be achieved. The intention, and again, we'll come back to this during the discussion, is around responsible contractual behaviours, flexibility with fairer terms. I think all of us, either here on the panel or participating, recognise that there are certain mixed messages around. But Susanna, if you could just pop onto the second of my slides, please. That what we are looking, though, is very much the government, the public sector's role. You know, we've heard a lot in recent weeks around project speed, Boris's agenda for building better, building faster, building greener. What it is going to require is the public sector as a best practice employer. And again, without going through each of those items in detail, we've identified some of those key drivers. Importantly is going to be the role of procurement and indeed how the tier 1, tier 2 of the supply chain is managed, is operated. I'm sure we'll come back and deal with these in our panel discussion, but at this point, I'll pass on to Gary.
It's actually Will.
Oh no. Hi there. So thanks David, and thanks Dale. What I want to look at is the role of the client as well. So I'd sort of take a risk management perspective on some of these things. And if we step back in a way to sort of pre-COVID times, we look and see in historical terms that a client ideal might be that they can buy in the management services for projects and transfer all of the risk. But what becomes clear very quickly is that effective client capabilities, or the capabilities of the client to be a client to the project, are to help them ensure effective interfaces between, that they provide an effective interface between the use of the overall asset and its design and construction. So what we've seen prior to COVID is people like the Institution of Civil Engineers with Project 13 promoting clients' greater understanding of the value they can add and where they're best placed to add value to deliver better project outcomes. Now, in particular, they're sort of trying to target greater understanding of their role in effective integration of the supply chain. But if we have a look at what COVID brings and sort of understanding things from a resilience perspective, we're particularly keen in the discussion today to encourage and understand where a client can add value in ensuring effective risk management, and also to bring in resilience across the project's organisation, the wider supply chain, both pre and post contract. So what is resilience? I mean, resilience I'd see as a function of simplify, as a function of vulnerability and adaptive capacity, the ability to respond to any kind of shock that might come along. And we want to know how the client can better understand its role in that, both pre and contract. So I want to bring in Gary on sort of the first question here about sort of some of the ways. What do you think are some of the ways that clients can better understand the key vulnerabilities and strengths in the supply chain that they're for any project they're about to embark on?
Yes, thanks very much, Andy. So what I think you're highlighting, and the the COVID situation that Dale and David have highlighted, is it brings to the fore very much the fact that there needs to be a greater understanding of your supply chain strengths and weaknesses, and to understand these supply chain risks. That there are a number of supply chain analytical tools in the market that can support you there. Just drawing a parallel with other sectors, the manufacturing sector is actually very mature in this particular area, creating digital twins of their supply chain, analysing and monitoring risk all the way through delivery. So they're quite a mature sector. Just a few specifics. So we ourselves have a supply chain analytics tool in the market, which analyses something like £3 trillion worth of public sector spend. So public sector bodies, as you'd be aware, are obliged to publish spend over a particular threshold, and that enables us to provide insights into market and risk. So the supply chain analytics platform very much enables you to sort of identify risks around over-reliance and then credit risks related to key parts of your actual supply chain. So a couple of things there. Just moving on to a couple of other challenges around that the COVID period has brought, which is when you're actually looking perhaps in the pre-qualification stage at the financial strength of suppliers. Clearly, looking back at published accounts that may have been published 6 to 9 months ago will probably bear very little resemblance to the current situation, because COVID in the main would have had quite a dramatic impact on revenues of many businesses. So there's a need, if you like, to look at not only sort of backward looking indicators, but potentially also looking at forward-looking indicators, and we've been doing this with a few clients. Easier said than done, as you can appreciate. Easier to be done with larger businesses and publicly listed businesses, of course, because there you get data around shorting of shares, a bit more information around any changes to supplier terms, anything around that changes to credit ratings, S&P or Dun & Bradstreet ratings, obviously media reports, etc., and any reports of forecast in pipeline. As I said, that's easier to do with larger publicly listed companies, and if you're looking at in terms of your lower tier suppliers, SMEs, for example, that level of information is not readily available. So going forward, that will be a challenge that I think clients will need to address through perhaps introducing some form of self-reporting by SMEs that are on your framework or interested in working with you. But I think what it does bring to the fore is it's not a static thing. Is you need to look at the financial strength of your supply chain and their risks over the life of a particular program. Thank you.
And like you say, in terms of bringing in understanding of suppliers' potential performance issues as you approach the market, particularly if you've got a project where there are limited few suppliers in there, and understanding how your tier ones are also using those tools when it comes to their suppliers as well. I imagine that's quite an important area to explore as well. I mean, with that better understanding of vulnerabilities, I mean, my hope is that organisations are able to respond to better understanding of vulnerabilities pre-contract to help actually build in resilience within contracts as they start to get set up as well. And not only in terms of procurement, but how they might restructure the organisation of the supply chain and the way they structure themselves amongst the client and the suppliers and the and sort of end user feedback as well. So when we approach the supply chain, that key point in time around procurement, I wanted to bring in Will on that question. I mean, Will, what have you seen really? What have you seen so far in terms of organisations and projects where they have started to look at structuring and different ways of procurement to help bring in better sort of supply chain resilience and better project outcomes?
Sandy, and thanks, Gary. Hope you can all hear me okay. I guess just taking a step back from before things changed fundamentally, I think we were seeing, from my perspective, in response to the challenges that we've always kind of grappled with for some time now, a growing shift towards value-based procurement from clients and industry, and CLC included, certainly advocating for a value-based approach. And I think the forefront. And I guess what value-based procurement means in practice, I think is fair to say we perhaps haven't quite landed on that naturally across the industry, and I'm not sure that we will. But often in practice, I guess what we're seeing from many clients these days, certainly at the simpler end, weighting non-price evaluation criteria more and more, recognising the importance of the underlying capabilities of teams and organisations, and their behaviours are key to enabling greater value. Some clients are also beginning to grapple with the more fundamental challenge of redefining value for money, with a focus on outcomes, and engaging commercially on that basis is something that is a real challenge. Just from my experience, kind of firsthand, with the likes of Anglian Water and Sydney Water back in Oz, along with others who are pushing the boundaries on contracting for outcomes. I guess the real value there is providing the supply chain with that space to innovate and more effectively manage risks, and rewarding the delivery of those outcomes less is simple to say, yet quite a very different approach beneath the surface, and certainly requires both parties, contractor and client, to take a bit of a leadership role to make that shift. We're also seeing clients starting to look at the nature of their relationships with the wider supply chain, so going beyond just those initial direct relationships, and investing more in relationships with smaller suppliers that perhaps have greater influence over their outcomes than perhaps some of the larger players may do. And examples of this sort of include the likes of Heathrow, Anglian Water's Spa Alliance, where I'm lucky enough to find myself at the moment, and other Project 13 adopters in particular, so Sydney Water, Network Rail, Sellafield, and others as well. So I'll hand back to Gary, who's just going to start to take a look at the theme of Reinvent.
Thank you. If we could. So the pandemic, we believe, provides an opportunity for the sector to reinvent the supply chain through the opportunity for it to participate in the recalibration of the economy and to address specific challenges that David outlined earlier around net zero and building social value, etc. So clearly you need a resilient supply chain to do this. What is going to start to drive this step change? So Will and Andy have just outlined the criticality of the role of the client, which I'd completely agree with from an integration perspective. I also think from a pipeline perspective as well, providing the industry with a strong pipeline, one that's credible, one that the supply chain can then understand and plan for going forward, are critical things there. One of the things we've been grappling with is whether there needs to be a greater focus on supply chain resilience, a more explicit focus. I think, going back into my previous experience, I think it's always been thought about, but probably never been a paramount consideration in terms of the way that programs are launched and initiated. So I think there probably needs to be a greater focus on this, potentially through a reform of the Green Book. So, so if you think about the different cases that are reflected in the Green Book, perhaps a strategic case, having an explicit recognition around the role of the supply chain in delivering the types of outcomes that Will was alluding to. The economic case, a direct recognition of the contribution that a supply chain, particularly a homegrown supply chain, which will make us more resilient, can make to UK PLC going forward. And then the management and commercial case, perhaps addressing how does the supply chain need to be configured, procured, in order to address your high impact, low probability black swan events, Covid-19 being one, the 2008 financial crisis been another. But of course, we also have to face the high impact, high probability events. You know, what will our world look like post-Brexit? That could be an opportunity, but it also could be a risk. The advent of new technology provides an opportunity, but it also does provide a risk to programs going forward. So a real focus on the business case in addressing that, so that the programs are launched and configured very much with that in mind. And then just a few thoughts around what does reinvention look like under the scenarios. Clearly, this will require a range of different potential approaches, from operational, behavioural to financial and commercial approaches. I think just linking back to some of the points that Andrew and Will made around the role of the client, you know, the reward for outcomes rather than on lowest margin, I believe will be a key thing to strive for. Again, easier said than done, but it can be done. That there are examples where that has been that has been approached. The London Underground Bank Station Capacity Programme was configured with that in mind. To an extent, the London Olympics delivery partner role was configured where rewards were linked to outcomes on the programme as well. The fair allocation of risk, so as an acknowledgement that you just cannot transfer all outturn cost risk to your supply chain. It will ultimately come back to you as a client. So a greater recognition there. And as Will and Andrew touched upon earlier, the client assuming a greater responsibility for integration, which doesn't mean they necessarily directly do that role. Yeah. They could outsource it or do it in partnership, but they have to be alive to the fact that they need to be a key cog in that integration. And there's clearly a whole range of other features that will drive this reinvention. And just to use a sort of an experience, a minor case study is a project that we've been involved in Wales, which has been the Core Valley Lines transformation project, which has been driven by Welsh Government and Transport for Wales. And there, very much the client has acted as the integrator. It has procured a design partner. It has procured an integration partner, which is one of the main contractors that would ordinarily do these types of things. And then it's adopted direct contracts through what it calls its IDPs, its independent delivery partner contracts, which are a mix of main contractors that clearly have the capability and balance sheet to deliver major works, but also it uses local suppliers and SMEs in order to build resilience in the local market, and of course extract the IP that can sit within that particular tiers. Overlaid there is an alliance approach with a common goal, and rewards for all of the participants in the alliance linked to the delivery of key milestones and outcomes on that particular project. Clearly, with any alliance is the issue of building trust, which is again probably a bit like marriage, often a long and painful business. But the alliance there, I'm aware, is seeking to achieve collaboration under ISO 44001. So just a few features there where you have actually got a program that's starting to embrace some of the features we're talking about, which will drive resilience going forward. If I hand over to Dale now, please.
Great, thank you all. So we'll start the Q&A bit, but before we sort of digitally throw the floor open, so as Suzanne said, feel free to log your question and we'll address it to the panel. But I wanted to start with a few, and I guess we'll follow the sort of reset, reinvent flow and go to the here and now. I guess question for David, which is, you know, what I guess we've been all anticipating. But as we go through that reset, how do you see the sort of challenges in managing prospective claims around impact of time, cost, particularly given, I guess, what has been changing industry advice and government advice as we've been through this period?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point from where to start, Dale, and I'm sure that everybody involved in the webinar will have their own issues and have been wrestling with, as I think I mentioned in my introduction, you know, slightly mixed messaging, and indeed, as Gary, Andrew and Will have just touched on there, that we are going to very clearly see and have already seen tensions between aspirational outcomes and indeed the contract terms. What we're seeing, quite rightly, quite understandably, is guidance and advice with regard to flexibility, not applying contract terms rigidly, and indeed extending to concepts of equitable adjustment or good faith. In today's environment, where most of our standard form contracts, and indeed those negotiated on a bespoke basis, will talk about prospective assessments, we are seeing and have seen variations, changes, which are very much looking at the assessments on that prospective basis. We know government guidance was precisely that. It was not a change of law. We're therefore seeing issues around arguments of force majeure, or indeed there have been amendments to contracts providing for specific circumstances of force majeure, giving time but not money. The issue here, of course, which is now being faced, is when one's looking at a prospective basis and we are seeing change, social distancing, for example, 2 meters down to 1 meter, that if an assessment was made based upon the 2 meters, then how is it going to be reassessed on a 1 meter basis? The whole concept of equitable adjustment for lawyers, for all industry advisors, is a source of concern, because the tribunals, the case authority, the law in England and Wales will say that one has to follow the contract terms. The NEC, as we know, is often misquoted as saying, as in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. Interestingly, that provision within the contract says, and also in accordance with its terms, the terms of the contract. Therefore, it's important that parties are understanding of what the contract terms say, and importantly, ensure that where required to give notices, where are required to provide the substantiation and the updated particulars, be that of time or money, especially in these circumstances, the parties to the contract are doing that. We are seeing, you know, collaboration and you know, in practice, and really working to those outcome and value events that Gary and Will in particular just referenced, where there has to be some flexibility and support from employers, from contractors through the supply chain. But I think at the moment, Dale, the single biggest issue that we are seeing with regard to the prospective assessments is, there is still this win-win mentality that needs to be built down in our industry. And what I suspect is that the assessments that have been made, albeit on an interim basis, that there has to be consensus in how those decisions might be revisited. I don't know if any of the other panelists are seeing similar, or indeed have got other views which they might want to share.
Not at my end.
Yeah, Dale, I think.
Comprehensive answer from, I'd say, David.
So, sorry, I was just highlighting that we'll come back to what it is that clients can do in terms of supporting contractors as we go through this, because we've got a couple of questions coming on that, so we'll come back to that point. But if I can move to Andy. So in relation to this sort of resilience and your point about building adaptive capacity, I guess while we're all in reflective space, and it's a bit unfair because we are still coming out of all of this, but you think that there are things we should already have learned that would stand us in better stead if we face the next crisis?
Yeah, maybe. If I sort of glibly put it in a way, we're starting to see sort of where we've talked before about things threatening stability and sustainability, that actually it doesn't take much of a shock. I mean, this is hopefully a rare event, but it only takes a shock to knock things off course. And I'd say what I think some of the organisations that I've been working with have seen is that they've had to, in the midst of all this, very quickly understand what the critical value activities are that they need to get done on a shock, and as a result of COVID. And because they're operating with interdependent supply chains, they've had to do this through collaboration. Now, some organisations have been better set up than others, and others are sort of saying, well, damn, if only we'd have sort of understood this beforehand, because the crisis put a lot of pressure on. It made it very difficult to do decision making. They had very limited time to do make quite significant decisions about which sites they had open, responding to government advice, how they start to track things. And the organisations that were reasonably well prepared in advance about sort of pandemic thinking were able to sort of at least get some of those things into play as soon as possible, to give them as much time as possible to deal with the day-to-day with its supply chain. But for organisations under cash flow pressure, it didn't take much for them to sort of be knocked off course. And we have seen in the industry that some organisations are facing survivability challenges as a result of the shock. I'd say, if we're reflecting, I'd say actually how the Construction Leadership Council has dealt with things is pretty good, really. It's gone, rather than just reflecting, it's gone straight into action mode, and that's brilliant. It's sort of said, right now we need capacity and protection of certain vulnerabilities urgently, and some of these measures are get them into place as soon as you can, deal with pipeline, talk with government, do these other quick decision-making things. But we also know that things are going to take some time with COVID. The economic outlook is particularly not well understood. We don't know how that's going to affect different, the fact that we've been funding, the government's been funding things, how that might affect things. So again, what the CLC are doing is right in that they're saying we do need to reinvent. We need to look at long-term sustainability and long-term stability. And some of those things that we've been talking about in industry in the past are the right things to tackle. So I think whilst we don't get much time at the moment to reflect, it's brought home very quickly to people that they need to respond to some of the challenges that the industry has been putting out there for some time. Yeah,
that's a very good point in itself, that the space for reflection might disappear as we get into to build. So on the Reinvent. I guess this is one for Gary, but Andy, you may have some also thoughts. On the old adage that you can only manage what you can measure, and you raised this interesting issue about measurement. So are there things we should be measuring and putting in place now to support the development of greater sustainability and supply and resilience within our supply chain?
Yeah, it's a good challenge, Dale. So I think there are a range of measures from sort of operational, commercial, and financial indicators, contractual, that could be considered to, if you like, I suppose, track the progress of enablers and direct improvements in supply chain resilience. So I suppose, you know, some rather blunt measures around, you know, numbers of insolvencies, numbers of failures, to factors around measuring any improvements to cash flow and balance sheet strength of suppliers, to factors around measuring you know, the amount of homegrown talent that is perhaps used on infrastructure projects, and potentially around, you know, the capacity of the supply chain, in order to provide a sort of an indicator of how the supply chain resilience is improving or otherwise over a time horizon.
Yeah, very good. Andy, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say in that as well, we see stress testing is one of these things that's quite helpful for organisations to look at against any kind of sort of a generic shock that might be coming up. And I think sort of some of the things you say about understanding where organisations' existing resilience can change. We've got you mentioned earlier, the global financial crisis, and actually what the financial sector has learned over the last 10 years is it's recognised it's got some vulnerabilities and needs to address them. And it's started recognising where we can't measure things, we need to do some stress testing, think about what could go wrong, and deal with it. But then also it has
into the system.
That's it. Or recognising where they need it, but they have still tackled the measurement question as well. I mean, they've looked at what are the measures that we need to put in place to give us a better sense of a better early warning of potential instability to come, in terms of capital ratios on leverage and how much capital banks have on their balance sheet. And I wonder how much the construction industry could learn from, not necessarily how they got into the problems, but how the financial sector has responded in the last 10 years.
Yeah, actually, a couple of you mentioned the opportunity to learn from other sectors, which I'll come back to if I have time. But Will, on the point of rather than other sectors, more immediate case studies. So across the panel, you mentioned that we've got some case studies and some examples of good practice. So there are benefits already been demonstrated in some of those examples that we can hold up for clients and supply chain, and you know, examples that help set direction and promote future change. There's a challenge, isn't there, about, you know, when do we start to see the benefits of this better way of working?
Absolutely. I think, thanks, Dale. I think it's the $1 million question, and reality probably much more valuable question than that. And I guess start off by saying, I mean, I think one thing that I've heard a few people in industry say is we do know what we get from the current approach, and if we certainly want something different, we do need to change. And that's kind of where that true leadership that I mentioned earlier, you know, needs to come from all sides and all levels of industry. I guess in the current context, I'll lean reasonably heavily on my personal experience with Sydney Water before jumping on to a couple others, but just in the current context of the challenges we faced over the last sort of 3 to 6 months. I know it would be interesting to understand how collaborative models have performed through this period. And using that Sydney Water example, I guess they were certainly able to achieve a major milestone, effectively handing over the keys to all of their assets from one partner to 3 new ones on time through that period, which I think is a demonstration of some serious success. And underpinning that success was certainly a collaborative approach. And more generally, again, through the Sydney Water example and their Partnering for Success program, through their regulatory submission, they actually banked in upwards of 15% savings. And following contract close last year, we were able to secure 8 to 10% of those savings in key cost components. And with greater collaboration and integration throughout the product lifecycle or the project lifecycle, they're certainly anticipating an exponential increase in the savings that they'll look to realise. But as I said, they've sort of already got 8 to 10% of those. And moving on to some other examples, I know Anglian Water have been able to secure upwards of 15% efficiencies, kind of amp on amp, for some time now. And on Spa, where I find myself at the moment, we're certainly looking to push that 15% boundary. And then, speaking with the likes of Sellafield and a few others, Sellafield through their program and project partners model are certainly have some quite ambitious savings targets that they've committed themselves to. And I think that commitment and the back-to-back nature of the commitment, so clients making that leap, really drives that collaboration, because these big numbers that we're throwing around on major infrastructure programs and projects, they don't get realised without both client and contractor really working together in a fundamentally different way.
Thank you. So I got a fairly pithy point, which I think is really relevant to our industry. And I guess probably maybe David and Gary, you could pick this one up. But if we acknowledge that we are in a risk-averse competitive market, how realistic is it really to move towards partnership and towards value-based outcomes for the greater good? I mean, I guess the question highlights, it sounds like it's a good direction, but is that realistic given our starting point and how embedded our approach to risk really is?
Sorry, you would kick off, David, and I'll come in.
Just very briefly, I would say it absolutely has to change. If one builds on what Will has just explained and the case studies there, that leadership has to involve all parties. Leadership might mean different things, but in terms of the agenda for change, certainly from the perspective that we may see, would be the effective communication, ensuring that the key project deliverables are achieved, and that there is transparency and transparency of everything. I think Will's point, relaying that the water industry, I think is actually a very good one, that through the years of the AMP programs, there has been a change and probably wrong terminology, but a flip-flop in terms of, is it in the 5 or 7 year period looking at life cycle costings of the asset, or is it simply about minimizing immediacy of capex? All those decisions have an impact and very, very clearly have impact on the decisions for the investments that we're talking about here, in terms of the improved training, looking at stability of supply chains for the main tier 1 contractors. So, Gary, I'm sure you've got many other thoughts.
Build on that.
I would agree, David, that if we're to drive real sustainable change and create a more resilient supply chain, we have to move and change. And partnership working, it is, as the question suggested, easier said than done. Rewarding against value is easier said than done, but there have been examples of that. Will touched upon a few. I alluded to a few instances there. the fact is these have to be, I firmly believe these have to be grabbed and pushed ahead and potentially piloted on one or two projects going forward. I think we already are seeing a number of clients changing gradually in the way that they are starting to look at the way they procure projects going forward. So you know, we've spoken about, we've touched upon the issue of trust. Trust is key to partnership working and realizing outcomes, and some procurement techniques these days are starting to look at behaviours as part of the way that bids are valued. So as I said, I think there is little choice but to move down this type of avenue, and you know, the traditional approach of procuring for lowest value, I think has been shown probably not to work in many instances, and a greater move to at least incentive-based models is a more powerful way to move forward to generate that sustainability.
So we'll go from granular issue, and I'm conscious of time, but I really wanted to get this one in. So I guess the few people have highlighted recently that COVID is an immediate crisis, but the environment and sustainability is an existential crisis. So this is a really complex question, but maybe Will and Andy, if you pick this up briefly, how do we balance the green agenda? You know, where's carbon reduction, sustainability go as we do this recover and reinvent phase? And I guess if you've got a headline, what would you like to see government to do as part of that? Will?
I can have a quick go. I think from a headline perspective, it's going to that shift to outcomes and customer and societal outcomes, noting that, you know, really if we can get clarity around and well-defined customer and societal outcomes, it does set ourselves up to deliver those. And I think, you know, the fundamental shift in procurement models to procuring for value, but bringing in those outcomes into your procurement process and approach, I think is a step in the right direction, and quite a fundamental step. As you mentioned, it's a reasonably complex question, but that'll probably do for me for now. Andy?
Yeah.
But again, we've got some case studies that support that, so maybe we can feed that into the answers we provide afterwards. Andy?
Yeah, I was going to say on the green agenda, as well as how the supply chain responds to things, it's also how government can incentivise finance into projects that incentivise private finance into projects that can help deliver the green agenda. And we, in a way, you can start to look at things like resilience bonds as a mechanism there to justify the improvement in long run costs for public sector clients and for UK PLC or in other countries' balance sheet, if you like, on what the impact of climate responsive projects can do to minimise costs overall. So I think tackling that question is a fundamental for the green agenda. But I think what I'd like organisations to really have an understanding really of, as I mentioned earlier, of where they can influence the levers that are threatening supply chain stability. I mean, Gary's point there about least cost at tender does not mean least cost overall, and there are a number of different things that you can look at that start to, in a way, they stop clients seeing certain things as a wish list item. Well, this project needs to be done for a certain way. We can't possibly look at that kind of initiative in this project without actually necessarily seeing that those initiatives are likely to give better outcomes overall. So I'd like for the government, when it's looking to supply chains, to encourage clients to throw their weight behind some of the things that the CLC are talking about.
Yeah. No, carbon sustainability is an outcome. So I'm conscious of time, so I think at that point we probably need to move on from questions. So thank you to 4 panelists, both for presenting the argument and for fielding those questions. A great job, thank you very much. As we said at the start, there will be a follow-up. We'll provide a response to all the questions that have been raised and circulate that. Also circulate a copy of the slides. And as Suzanne mentioned, a recording of today's event will be available as well. So I guess with that, thank you to everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. And with that, I'll close the webinar.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.